Okay, we have to keep things moving along. I'd love to have some feedback from you on what you reckon. So you've had a chance to look at 4 different systems. Let's do the second question first. Let's do a quick show of hands. I just want you to put your hand up for which one you like best. So who liked the European Union approach best? Any takers? Ooh, Europe's not very popular. Who likes Western Australia best? Not very popular. Who likes California best? A couple of shows of hands. And who likes Canada best? And about half of the class didn't vote. Thank you. All right, so we're having a conversation mainly here by the look of things. So tell us about some of the advantages and disadvantages that you see of things. So what was in the European one? No one voted for it, but there's some interesting things in it, and there's some things in the European one that are not found in the other ones that I noticed. What are your thoughts about the European approach?
That is requirements of the EIA directive. And also mentioned a bit about the different types of alternatives.
So it says it's a requirement. That's a start, right? It sort of makes it mandatory, and then it has those lists, doesn't it? It lists what 6 types. It says in the guide. It says these are the 6 things.
Yeah, and they also always need to be feasible.
So it talks about feasibility. Yeah. Do any of the other ones talk about feasibility?
Canada is really only concerned with technology and feasibility.
Right. And
a bit limiting, but probably most practical. Comes down to it, I think. Just
and so what do you think what is feasibility? What do you understand feasibility to mean? So if they say, so there's different words, right? Some of them talk about reasonable. I think the Europeans say reasonable, but they also say feasible, right? So what does feasible mean? If you're the proponent, who judges feasibility? Do any of them have any guidance on what feasible is meant to mean?
You actually say that an alternative may be considered unreasonable or feasible if, and they talk about like technologies, if there are something issues with the budget.
So it's got a bit of information, hasn't it? And it does relate it to the it relates to the purpose of the project, doesn't it? So you only expected to put forward alternatives that relate to the. So there's a feasibility there as well, like it's a mining project. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else to say about Europe? Anyone pick up on public involvement provision? Am I right in thinking that Europe's the only one that mentions the public? What does it say about the public? It encourages the public to be involved somehow. You want to pick that up? It's there. Doesn't mandate it. Doesn't say there will be public consultation. Anything else about Europe? Anyone pick up that it said that both the developer and the competent authority should consider alternatives, or must? I think it actually says must, or equivalent. All right, probably not. Just, it's all there. It's all there. Just words on the page. That's all it is. So the whole thing about legislation is that you just read what it says and translate it into common sense. So it does say, there it is, local knowledge and interests are also very important during the assessment of alternatives, and therefore dialogues with the public concerned alternatives are encouraged. It doesn't actually say, it doesn't mandate the public to be involved, but it encourages it. So, but do any of the others mention the public? I don't remember the public being mentioned in any others. could be implicit, because if you're preparing an environmental impact statement and the public at least going to review that statement, there is some involvement of the public, but it's actually talking about the discussion or the derivation of alternative, isn't it?
The Canadian one does refer to Indigenous knowledge, but not as the alternative. It includes it in there.
Yeah. Okay. And it could be inferred. It could be, we know we've looked at Canada a couple of times. We know that it's got a list of A to N or something like that in the alphabet of purposes of EIA. And so if you look at those purposes, it includes Indigenous involvement. So perhaps perhaps Canada are making it implicit that good EIA will always do those things, including the consideration of. We're not quite sure, and maybe, whereas the California approach tends to be a little bit more, you got to do it this way. And here's a court case that if you're, not paying attention, this is where it all comes from. What else does it say? Somewhere it said they also have to do the do nothing option. Is it? Am I right in thinking that Europe's the only one that specifically mentions the do nothing option, and it actually must be or should be dealt with? I can't see off the top of my head where the developer is. I thought it mentioned that the competent authority, there it is. Alternatives are to be identified and assessed both by the developer and the competent authorities. Is there anywhere else? Did California mention that it's not just the proponent who must look at alternatives, but also the competent authority or the decision maker? Does WA? Does WA have a role for the EPA to assess alternatives? Okay, so lots of differences you could see. Let's go on to the other one. So what do we want to say about WA? Any comments about WA?
I think WA is more that it's more mitigation, their alternatives, rather than as a assessment in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, they're not using the word assess, are they? They just say comparison, don't they? On the screen there, it says, including a comparison of the environmental impacts of each alternative. So are you expecting, detailed impact predictions and mitigation strategies and significance evaluations of each alternative? I don't think so. Not really strongly worded like that. So WA doesn't say very much. Canada doesn't say very much. We know that as well, but it's a bit different. What about sorry? What about California? What did you make of California? Very detailed, obviously. Any thoughts about California? Any reaction? This is the moment you can talk and share. Get used to talking about EIA. Any thoughts? Well, I'll circle back to Daniel's table because they're talking to me. I'll sit with them, in fact. What did you make of California?
California was after the president in their EIR to alternatives cases. In real world, it's not normally happened. Alternatives normally, my point of view is connected.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the cases, if or developer or corporate want to have your project in some normally they have to choose the specific location.
Yeah.
In that case, they don't provide alternatives and locations. So
But
that's
under-
what happened in my field. The California should means do it
yeah.
in my
But
understanding.
I mean, so obviously Europe mentions alternative location, so does WA, but isn't there some examples in California of what needs to happen with the locations? Don't they talk about if it's affordable or reasonable?
Yeah, also talk about feasible,
Feasible, yeah.
or feasible, yeah.
But they don't say you absolutely must. There they are. I got it highlighted there. Focus on alternatives to the project or its location which are capable of avoiding. Oh, that's significant. They got the significance test. Okay, so California, and so does Europe, doesn't it? California and Europe both stress the significance test, don't they? They said only alternatives that have a significant difference are worth considering. So Western Australia doesn't do that. I don't think Canada does that, does it either? So that's an interesting point. Significance is there very strongly in both Europe and California. And they also both related to the project objectives, so that feasibly accomplish most of the basic objectives of the project. I thought California had something about I thought they had something about where you could afford it. I can't remember now. Yeah, there it is. It's the one in the middle that I've got highlighted in the middle of the screen. Feasibility alternatives are site suitability, economic viability, availability of infrastructure. I mean, availability of infrastructure is an interesting one because you think about it, you could put a wind farm in many places, but the purpose of a wind farm is to generate electricity to feed into the grid to give electricity, say, to a city. So, putting a wind farm really, really remote a long way away, there won't be any infrastructure to bring that electricity to the city. So that kind of consideration is really very real. What else they got? They showed general plan consistency, other plans or regulatory limitations. That's looking now at the planning network of government. You don't want to put an industrial project in a residential area, that kind of thing, they're thinking about those things. Or you don't want to put a highly polluting industry in a sensitive water catchment, groundwater catchment, or something like that, a river, a drinking water catchment. So there might be rules you have to think about. Jurisdictional boundaries, okay, that's fine. And whether the proponent can reasonably acquire, control, or otherwise have access to the alternative site. So you were saying it's a bit unusual to go for locations, but there's the sort of, there's the balancing part of that from a regulator point of view. Is it reasonable that they can afford it? I mean, if land is scarce and the prices are high, then they can't afford it. Or if it's a case of, some other thing. I mean, obviously,
This happened, in somewhere in China, is developed, industrial development zone or industrial park there. And after a couple of years later, and the residential developed very close to there. So what happened is the people just can feel the pollution and they rush into the manufacturing site and block the road, block the doors. With a lot of problems. So this is what happened in the location is very important, of course. But there are planned areas special for some specific industry.
yes, yeah.
Industry development park in the swamp. Industrial something like that. So there's a planned well. So if you for a job for the location, you must get approval from the government, and then you can. So in most cases, if you submit your proposal, this location should be no problem now.
Yes, yeah. So if so that assumes that you've got your
Location first.
you've got planning done. That's planning done.
That's right.
In Western Australia, often that's not the case. We've got a lot of what we call vacant crown land.
Yeah, I know.
And so it's not the case that there's detailed planning. So it depends. In the settings.
That's right.
Yeah. So quite a lot of differences. In how these things are put forward, and what they include. So, so I'll leave it with you. I hope it's useful to think about that. As always in this unit, I want you to think about, you know, what might be best practice, and if you don't, you know, it's up to you. A lot of you don't want to talk to me during the class. That's fine. I hope you're still thinking. I hope you're still benefiting from being here. I'd like you to talk to me so I understand what's in your head, but that's okay. You don't have to. I'm sorry if I feel biased towards the people who are speaking, but it's meant to be a dialogue, and I do want to have a dialogue with you, and I can only talk to the people who are talking back. But I hope it's useful to think of this, to look at these different examples. I can't tell you what I personally think is the best way to do alternatives because I'm still a bit confused. I still don't know whether we should require assessment of alternatives. Certainly, if you don't require it, they don't do it. But if you do require it, if you're considering, suppose you've got 5 big alternatives to a project and you do 5 assessments, well, 4 of them are a waste of time because they're never going to go ahead. You're only ever going to go ahead with the one you choose. But if you spend $1 million on each of these 4 other EIAs, that's $4 million wasted. Surely that $4 million could go to an offset or a new conservation estate, protecting the environment, better mitigation. So, you know, it's not easy. I'm not asking you easy questions, and I don't have answers for all of these questions that I ask you because I don't know myself. And the point is not to know or not to know or not to know. It's the point is to understand real life, how you make a law, how you make guidance to serve a law, how you implement that, how you do EIA. You know, how should we do this? We've got to do something. You can't just let development happen, but how much detail should we have? Don't have easy answers. I think alternatives is really interesting because it's really hard. It's really, really hard. Let me demonstrate. I've got some case study examples to share with you, and there's a range of examples. These are all from Western Australia, but they're just a range of different things, different areas. And there's another question I put to you as a reflection question or discussion question. Should the treatment of alternatives in EIA be the same for if you're a private proponent versus a government proponent? And in some of the examples I've got, some of them are government, some of them are private, and maybe there's a difference and maybe there's not. Maybe there should be a difference, maybe there shouldn't be. Again, I don't know the answer, and I'm putting a difficult question to you for you to think and work it out for yourself. So the first one is a limestone quarry. So we're talking, it's a private proponent and they're mining limestone, and essentially there's no mention of alternatives by the proponent whatsoever. In theory, what you've just learned about EIA in Western Australia, that shouldn't happen, because in theory, that if they're following the guide to doing an environmental review document, they should have had something. There's nothing, no mention. And the Environmental Protection Authority, when they assessed it, just did 2 sentences, and those 2 sentences are on the screen. So here's an EIA with 2 sentences about alternatives, and one of the sentences is saying that the proponent didn't consider any, but they have designed the operation in stages and to occur in a manner which reduces its visual amenity impacts and impacts from noise and dust. So there is some alternatives around how they're actually mining the limestone, but even if there's no consideration of alternative location. So that's example 1. Example 2, the forest management plan. There's no mention of alternatives in this one. This is an interesting one because it's a forest management plan. It's about the future uses, or the next 5 years of uses of our forests in Western Australia. You know, a couple of million hectares of forest land. And there are multiple uses of those forests. So they're being used for many different things. There's mining of bauxite, there is water catchment, there is beekeeping, there is conservation, there is bushwalking trails, mountain bike trails, all sorts of things. So there's a whole lot of activities and there's timber harvesting or some degree of that. But when it came to the actual appeals convener, so there were many appeals, many hundreds, more than 1,000 people appealed against the EPA report on the forest management plan. And one of the contentious issues was fire management. And so the appeals convener actually did report about alternative ways of options for managing fire. So that's interesting. It sounds like there were some alternatives that could have been compared by the proponent that were not, and perhaps should have been. They ended up being assessed because the appeals convener did the job, but perhaps the proponent should have done this up front. So that's an interesting scenario. This is I know you can't read this, but this is the entire consideration of alternatives for Worsley mine expansion. So this is bauxite mining down near Boddington Way in Western Australia. So it's about 150 kilometres from here. And they've been mining since the 1970s. And this EIA was for the mining company to expand the area of its bauxite mining. And they had various areas of jarrah forest that they could mine or might not mine. And the entire proponent's document, this is their entire text. So I know you can't read all that, but you can see it's just exactly 2.5 pages of text about alternatives around areas that they might mine, different ways of transporting those, and most of it's about transport and haulage. They've got a section at the back on no development alternative. So 3 paragraphs where they talked about, well, what happens if we don't mine? Is that, I know you can't read that, you haven't had time to read that, but does that sort of gel with what you read in the EU, the European Commission guidelines on how it should be done, or the Californian approach to how alternatives should be done? It certainly probably gels with how the Western Australian system is described. So the point being that what would it look like if we had this same mining project in Europe or this same mining project in California? Would it be different? Would the proponent be doing a lot of different stuff in this kind of thing? This one, this is hard to put on one slide, a bit unfair. It's a very old example, 1988, water supply option, but it's a really curious one because it's very hard to read at the top left. But the proponent proposed to do an EIA in 2 stages. And stage 1, they actually called the evaluation of alternatives. And what they did is they said, okay, we need to develop a new water supply. It was 1988, and they needed a new water supply for Perth by 1993. The reason being there was a population boom happening, a lot of people moving to Perth, and we'd run out of water, or we were rapidly running out of water. And so they said, we need to develop this water source in the next 5 years. It has to be technically feasible to develop in the next 5 years, and it has to have a minimum water yield. We need, I can't remember how many gigalitres, they put it up there. But so they had a water supply objective. We're not talking about a trivial amount of water, not just talking about putting a rainwater tank on the building to collect the rainwater runoff. We're talking about, certain millions of litres of water. And then they had environmental and social objectives to meet as well, trying to minimise the impacts. And what they did is they ended up looking at a whole lot of options. If you look at table 2, they looked at all of the options that might be possibly considered. And there's some really kooky ones there. They've got things like towing icebergs from Antarctica. They've got the idea of a 3,000-kilometre pipeline from the Kimberley in the northwest of Western Australia all the way down here. They've got the idea of desalinating seawater. Now, we didn't have desal in those days. We didn't get our first desal until this century, about 2005 or thereabouts, 2007, 2008, we got our first desal, and we've continued to build them since. So what you're seeing there is an interesting moment in history when the water planners were saying, we know there are lots of options, and here are these possible options, and they said, well, towing icebergs, not really economically viable. Big 3,000-kilometre pipeline, not really economically viable. Desalinating seawater, not economically viable. So they dismissed those things. But some of those things have come back. The pipeline keeps coming back, and the desal. And then what they did is they narrowed it down to 4 options. And then they did a series of studies of those 4 options. They looked at things like the impacts on fauna, the impacts on flora, the impacts on social well-being from these 4 different options. And they ended up coming down to the conclusion that the North Dandalup Dam was the best option. It's a #1 rating in that bottom right ranking. And they said overall, North Dandalup performs best of these 4 options. What they were going to do then was they were then going to do a stage 2 EIA of the environmental impacts and the mitigation and the management of North Dandalup Dam. However, what happened in reality is that the EPA was so impressed with how the proponent had handled this whole process and so impressed with the level of understanding of the issues that they said, no, you can just go straight to approval with these conditions attached and so on. So the point being that this was a very elaborate consideration of alternatives relative to most. If we look at a recent one, 2022 main roads, this is the Tonkin Highway. This is upgrading intersections on the Tonkin Highway and just the grade interchange. It's one of the case studies used for assignment 3 in this unit. And they actually said, well, they said up front, there are no alternatives to not implementing the proposal. The highway already exists. It's dangerous. There are crashes and problems with these intersections. We need to upgrade these intersections. So the do nothing option has been eliminated. And now it's like, well, what can we do as alternatives? And it turns out that they looked at different configurations of the road interchanges. Do you have a diamond shape? I think they settled on a half diamond or something like that. Do you have a diamond shape, a clover leaf shape, this kind of stuff? And the clover leaf would would have the biggest impact on vegetation, whereas the diamond, half diamond or whatever they called it, would have the minimum thing. So that's what their argument was around the sort of actual detailed design of this road layout configuration. But it's less than 2 pages of the document, just pages 11 and 12 sections there. Same proponent, main roads, but a couple of years before, planning for the Bunbury Outer Ring Road. And here they actually had an alignment selection report, which is a 400-page document looking at different ways you could align a road system to avoid the city of Bunbury. And then, so that document I haven't tried to summarise, but I've just summarised some of the key things from the environmental review document later on. They basically said, well, there's 2 ways we could do it. We could kind of go close to the coast down the existing highway way, or we could go inland, which is that green zone in that middle diagram, that sort of green shaded zone. They say we can either go down the red line, which is the existing roads that are there, and widen those, or we can go through this green belt. If we go through this green zone, then there are different configurations of road we could have because we've got room to move. We could do this kind of design, that kind of design, this kind of carriageway, that kind of interchange, this kind of so on. So they then compared all these options and they did what we call a multi-criteria analysis. You can see it's represented with red, green and orange and a traffic lights sort of scoring system where you look at all the different factors that you need to consider, like, some things are road safety, some things are impacts on plants, impacts on animals, and noise, all that sort of stuff. And they score each of these things and then compare them. Then from that, try to choose the best road option and road design. So quite an elaborate process to considering alternatives in this instance. I've given you this example previously, and I'm just reiterating it again around some years back where there was the need for a new boat launching facility near Ningaloo Reef up at Coral Bay. And the community and the regulators were a bit divided about the best way to do it. There were 2 sites that had been identified. One group of people liked the north site, one group of people liked the south side site. How do we decide this? Well, in this instance, the proponent asked the EPA to help. And they said, well, we've got these 2 possible sites. And they did their EIA in 2 parts. They did an EIA of site 1, an EIA of site 2. And then they asked the EPA to choose which they thought was the best one. And so the EPA did. It chose the North Bills Bay, and is that one? No, it considered that one unacceptable. Cannot meet the objectives, and it chose the other one. So then they went on to set some recommended conditions for the management of that chosen one. So that's an interesting way to do an EIA. Is that a useful way to think about a practice of doing the EIA? Actually doing an assessment of at least two options and putting them side by side. So closing thoughts. I think consideration alternatives is one of the more interesting topics in EIA. It's traditionally complained about being done badly, very badly, but it's also not clear what best practice would be. I don't think I could tell you what I think best practice should be. I can tell when something's done badly, but I'm not sure I would know how to write a piece of legislation for best practice for this one. I should probably challenge myself to have a go one day, see if I can do it. And I just finished with the quote from the English example from Pratt 2023. It is clear from a number of the articles in that particular journal edition that they're talking about that establishing a more consistent and thorough approach to consideration alternatives would be beneficial. You've seen that, California, European Commission, Canada, Western Australia, they're very different in what they ask proponents to do. There's no consistency. There's some commonality, but there's no consistency. So it would be kind of interesting to think about, could we actually develop a sense of international best practice and go with that? So I'll leave it with you. What might be best practice? If you just take a breather for 5, and we'll start at 10:02, and we'll get into public participation. Very interactive session. I want to get into it. So